Anyway, so what I was saying is that I have been hard at work on volume 2. And one of the things that I have discovered is that these concepts that we are discussing are actually very, very important as we get into Isaiah 52, Isaiah 53, and the entire concept of not only blood guilt, but also iniquity. So I want to make sure that thank you so much, hon, that we are solid in all of our concepts. So I know we've lost a lot of time here. So we are just going to go to the book club now and to the PowerPoint presentation. My son is helping me here. So it'll be just a minute and we will, that's all right. I don't need the video. We'll do without the video for now. Okay. So let's see if we can transition this. And I'm just going to make sure that everything shows up on you guys' end, seeing the fact that I've had problems with it today. So I know that I've spent a lot of time really wanting to lay a firm foundation of this idea of the family covenant. This is the covenant within the national covenant that Yahovah made with Israel's families. And this particular aspect that we have been looking at is this idea that Yahovah visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate him. But then at the same time, he shows mercy to thousands of them that love him and keep his commandments. Now, in the original text, the word generation does not appear here. And it's very fascinating in that everywhere else where in the Tanakh, where it means and intends generation, especially in the Torah, that term actually appears. But as we saw last week, generation is really the intended idea that Scripture conveys, especially when you look at this within the concept of how it played out in Israel's history and the case studies. But today I wanted to not just focus on the judgment portion, I also wanted to focus on the mercy portion. So I wanted also to get to more of the national concepts and the concepts of national judgment. That will actually be next week, because today we're going to look at some of what it means for Yahovah to show mercy to 1,000 generations. So we see that Yahovah reveals himself to Moses. Remember, the first time he does this at Mount Sinai. He does this when the mountain is on fire. There's a loud voice that is speaking. And then Moses goes up for 40 days, 40 nights. And during this time period, Israel rebels. Israel rebels against the very first commandment, which is to worship Yahovah, have no other gods before them, make no graven images, because Yahovah is jealous. So the very first thing Israel does is provoke Yahovah's jealousy. And then after they provoke Yahovah's jealousy, there's this discussion between Moses and Yahovah. Yahovah says, I'm just going to wipe them out. I'll make a nation through you and through your descendants. And Moses pleads on Israel's behalf. So after this interaction between Yahovah and Moses, God tells Moses that he will make his glory pass before him. He'll proclaim the name of Yahovah, but he's going to do two very specific things. He is going to tell Moses whom he will be gracious to and to whom he will show mercy. So the entire point, the entire purpose of Exodus 34, where Yahovah again recovenants with Israel after they breached pact, and he once again recovenants with them, is to define and to clarify who he will be gracious to and to whom he will show mercy. And this, as I have written in Volume 1, and you'll see again in the second book of the Volume 2 series, I find this to be very important and very critical when we try to understand why there is suffering in the world today. Why do we see what we would consider innocent people, good things happening or bad, evil things happening to good people. And so much of history, so much of not just history, but our forefathers' actions really come to bear in what we see today occurring all around us. So this is the combined covenants. This is the Sinai and Deuteronomy covenant, which are exactly the same. Now, if you guys are following Ross's teachings on Shabbat mornings, he's bringing out some of the details where there's slight differences between these two. But more or less, they really convey the exact same message. What you find is a different point that is not reiterated in the National Covenant with Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, is this clarification that Yahovah, even though he forgives iniquity, transgression, and sins, he does not clear the guilty. And we see this so much in life. Sometimes we see it by genetic inheritance, where children inherit a disease that is often, if you watch the Middleton, I think it's the Middleton genetics. There's an entire website. I think it's Mendelssohn. I'm sorry, I'm saying that incorrectly. But you can Google that, and it goes through the dominant and recessive genes of inheritance and how that works. The other thing that you find is that a lot of times the financial situation a child is born into also can bear a huge significant factor in determining that child's future. Education, the country in which you're born in. I mean, look around us today. If you're born in South Africa, China, or whether you are born in Indonesia versus the United States, what you have available to you, and I see that this is not exactly displaying just right. Let me try to move this on the screen real quick. What you inherit because of the nation in which you are born, that really plays a significant role in your future, being the land in which you're born and the people and nation. Not all nations share the same liberty and the same ideas of justice and judgment that the United States has historically. So a child does not determine where they are born, but rather it is their families that determine where they are born. If the family is able to immigrate, say, from a very oppressive nation, whether it's China or somewhere in South Africa or an oppressed Muslim society, if they are able to immigrate into a land of freedom, into a land that follows some sort of Mosaic code, they usually enjoy more liberty. But again, all of these things are determined based on the choices their forefathers have made. Now, sometimes those choices are up to them. Sometimes they can choose to immigrate to another nation and gain more liberty, but that option is not always open to every generation. So what I wanted to focus on today are some of the covenants of light, this idea more of the mercy of Yahovah. And I wanted to give case examples of where we see this mercy. The very first time that we see a covenant of light or a covenant of peace occurring in Scripture is actually with two women. It's Puah and Shiphrah, the two women who refused to slaughter Israel's children when Pharaoh asked for them to kill all the firstborn males in Israel. Anytime you see this idea of he made them houses, this is always a sure house. The reason it's called also a covenant of light is because Yahovah promises that these people will always have descendants to give a light to the fact that they had lived. Always have descendants to be a light to the fact that their ancestor had existed, and basically, they are still living more or less in their offspring because they still exist. So this is the first one. The other one, which is a little bit more famous, is the covenant of Phinehas. His covenant of light is also termed a covenant of peace. They are really the same thing, just different wording. And this particular covenant of peace is that Phineas would have the high priesthood, both him and his children after him, because they were zealous for Jehovah's covenant. Now, as we have seen in the past, this is also affected by the way that the house of Eli had dishonored their role, and that particular arm within the house of Phineas is cut off from acting as within the high priesthood, and it is transferred over to the house of Zadok. But it does not, even though that arm of Phineas's house is cut off, you notice that the overall covenant is not abrogated. It is still in effect, and it is still applies to the house of Phineas. The other one that we see is Jehovah's covenant with David. Again, Jehovah promises to make a covenant of a sure house with David. And if you go down to the part that I have highlighted, Jehovah says, if he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But his mercy will not depart away from him as I took it away from Saul. So when Saul rebelled against Jehovah, you find that he died in battle. You also find that his whole entire household, all of his children, Jonathan, all of his children died in battle. His one child, Mephibosheth, he survived, but he certainly was not someone who was really qualified to reign over Israel, just simply because he did not seem to have the mental acuity to do so. And then you find that David, of course, replaces Saul's house. And what Jehovah is doing here is he is promising David a sure monarchy, the right to rule. This right to rule, as far as a monarchy is concerned, if there is a monarchy in Israel, the only legitimate house is David's house as far as ruling over his people, Israel. Now, you also find that Jehovah makes a covenant of light with non-Israelites. The house of the Rechabites, they were not Israelites, but they were foreigners who had sought refugee status in Israel. They had lived in the land, they had lived peacefully, but their father had told them to live in tents all their days and to not drink wine. He did this so that they would not intrude on Israel's inheritance, but also so that they would have peace both with Israel and with their enemies. But you find as time passes on and the land becomes very unstable, you have Egypt on one side, and then finally you have Babylon on the other side. You find that the children take refuge in the city. And while they are taking refuge in the city, Jeremiah comes to them and tells them, here, drink some wine. And they say, no, we can't do that because our father has made us take an oath, a covenant, not to drink wine, all the days that we are in the land of Israel. And it may even be that this is beyond the land of Israel, just simply all the days of this particular family. Well, you find that they obey, and Jehovah says, why to the men of Judah, why can't you obey me like the children of the Rechabites? Why can't you obey me like that? And with this, Jehovah makes a covenant with the house of the Rechabites, the same one that he has offered to the house of David, the same one that he has offered to Puah, to Shiphrah, to Phinehas. And we're going to go ahead and read this one because this is a new concept, or as far as at least foreigners are concerned. And Jeremiah said to the house of the Rechabites, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the commandment of Jehonadab, your father, and have kept all his precepts and done according to all that he has commanded you. Therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not want for a man to stand before me forever. So you find that this covenant of light is given to a non-Israelite. And this extends well beyond 3 and 4 generations. This really extends to 1,000 generations. Think of this. This was 2,500 years ago. And to this day, the house of Phinehas, the house of David, the house of Rechab, the house of Puah, the house of Shiphrah, women, I might add, all of these people still have descendants today that give a testimony to the fact that their ancestor once existed and once did something that was good and right in the sight of Yehovah. Now, I brought this point before, but just to reiterate, covenants of light and peace could last for over 1,000 years to infinite generations. But in contrast to this, Jehovah's anger and his judgment does not last forever. It only extends to the third and fourth generation that hate him. Now, we're going to look at this in a little bit of detail. And what I want to focus on today really is how the sins, iniquity of the people, how that relationship between them and the land. And then next week, we'll come back and see this in the terms of national judgment and national consequences for the entire people. And this is really the idea of, when you have 2 or 3 families that have third and fourth generations that hate Yehovah, that refuse to walk in the land, well, Yehovah really deals with those people independently, and there is not a national judgment. But what happens when you start getting 100, 200, 300, 1,000 families in the land that hate Yehovah, that refuse to walk in his ways? That starts to become a serious issue. And Yehovah can't just deal with that family by family. What you find he does is when that occurs, there is a hiding of the face where he waits for their sins to come to a full. And that is what we're going to look at next week's class. This week's class, we're really going to focus on this relationship between between the iniquity of the people and the land. So just to reiterate again, this is a limit to Yehovah's mercy. Yehovah could, it would be within his right to say, okay, you have sinned in this generation and I am going to afflict you. I am going to, that's it. No mercy. The first time you sin, that's it. I am going to judge you, with some sort of harsh judgment. But you find that Yehovah is mercy and he does not do this. He waits to visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And what we find in this character of mercy is that Yehovah considers more than one person and more than one generation when he extends mercy or judgment. The second point being God, he considers the overall action of the heart of a family over a period of time. So this again is very, very merciful. I mean, one family could last a good 150 years before that family sees judgment. It gives them plenty of time to consider their ways and to turn from their iniquities. Yehovah does not rush to judgment, but he is patient for 3 to 4 generations. Now, again, hold on, let me go back and catch this. The limit of Yehovah's mercy, when 3 to 4 generations hate Yehovah, refuse to walk in his ways, judgment can fall on that family. Now, what we've looked at so far, we've looked at the national judgment. We looked at Israel's rebellion at the golden calf, where Yehovah put that injunction in Israel's covenant about not clearing the guilty. It appears that injunction was always there, but Yehovah just reiterated it and brought it to Moses' attention and to Israel's attention. He wanted to make very clear that even though he will forgive sin, he will not forgive the consequences of those sins, and he will not clear the guilty party. The other thing that we saw was Israel's rebellion with the spies. And this was Israel's 10th rebellion against Yehovah. So if you look at the time, it was basically 2 years. In the 2-year time period that Israel came out of Egypt, they had rebelled 10 different times. And Yehovah was patient with them. He forgave them every time. But what we're going to see in next week's class is that even though he forgave them at a certain point, rather than forgiving or bearing the sin, Yehovah then makes Israel bear their own sin. And this really becomes an important point to understand when you look at theological ideas beyond the actual judgment of Yehovah, and how this idea of judgment, suffering, justice, mercy, and righteousness all interact with each other, because none of these concepts stand alone. They all interact with each other. And as we look at Israel's history, we really get a good idea of this. So far we have looked at Eli's house. We've looked at Joab, where David and Solomon brought Joab's sin and his own blood guilt upon himself, so that it did not affect David's house or the house of Israel. We also saw that David's house lasted for 18 generations. It lasted until the sins of Manasseh, who was like a Stalin or a Hitler, a Mao. He was just wicked towards his own people, enslaying them. And it was at this point where Yahweh says, I am no longer willing to forgive the sins of David's house. And you find that after Manasseh, there were 4 wicked generations. Yahweh gave a chance to every single one of Manasseh's children to refrain from their sins, to return to Yahweh. They did not. And it is with that 4th generation, which ironically is not exactly in a chronological order, because Zedekiah was a 3rd generation from Manasseh. He and 3 of his brothers were all given a chance upon David's throne, as was Jeconiah, who was Jehoiakim's son, and Jehoiakim was the brother of Zedekiah. So you find that it's still 4 generations, but it doesn't necessarily occur in a chronological order. Then we find Jehu also sat upon the throne to the 4th generation, because he had done service to Yahweh. Likewise, Nebuchadnezzar had done service to Yahweh, and his children sit upon the throne to the 3rd generation. So what I wanted to focus on today really is more this idea of land and people, sin and iniquity. And I had alluded to this a little bit 2 weeks ago when we had met. Deuteronomy gives us many, many commands, and you find this over and over again. It's reiterated something like 7 times in Deuteronomy. And this is the idea that we should burn iniquity out of the land. When injustice occurs, we should not turn our eyes away. We should not pity. We should not conceal, but rather we should administer justice. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. This is Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11. It says, if your brother or your son, your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend, which is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods which we have not known, you or your fathers, and they to serve gods near to you or far from you, from one end of the earth of heaven to the other end of earth, you shall not consent to him, nor listen to him, neither shall your eye pity him, neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be the first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. And you shall stone him with stones that he die, because he sought to thrust you away from Yahweh your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. And all Israel shall hear and fear, and do no more any such wickedness that is among you. So notice this idea that Israel was not to show mercy in these situations. This act, the act of drawing Israel away from Yahweh, was considered an act of treason. If you think about it, if Israel is not going to worship Yahweh, she's not going to follow Torah. And it is the Torah that specifically grants her freedom and her longevity, her safety, and her peace on the land. So to depart from Yahweh was to depart from her own soul, to depart from the deity that granted her safety, peace, and prosperity by following his ways. The other thing that you find, and we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, was the idea that if there is blood guilt on the land, that you do not pity. You make sure that you administer justice where blood guilt is concerned. If you find someone who has committed premeditated murder, then you deliver him to the avenger of blood that he may die. You do not pity him. You put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel. And notice this phrase, that it may go well with you. The inverse of this is implied, is that if you do not put the guilt of innocent blood away from you, away from your land, then it will not go well with you. So Yahovah does hold a collective entity. He holds the leaders, he holds the nations responsible for what occurs on the land that they control nationally. What is under their power and their authority, Yahovah holds that people accountable and responsible for what takes place in their land. Again, we have Deuteronomy 19. This is going to be verses 16 and then 18 through 21. And this again is the idea of putting evil or kindling. The Hebrew word here is ba'ar. It's the idea that you are going to kindle or you are going to consume like fire this evil that is on your land. And I'm going to read this again. It says, if a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness is a false witness, and he has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So shall you put evil away, or rather here it is, so shall you burn away evil from among you. And those which shall remain shall hear and fear, and shall from now on commit no more any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity, but life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. And this again is really, really important. There are situations where Yahovah tells us to show mercy. There are situations where Yahovah says we should be lenient. But the key issues where in this case, a person who has committed perjury in a murder trial in seeking someone else to be put to death, these are serious issues and one that Israel was not to turn away from, but she was supposed to execute judgment so that it could go well with her. And not only that, but when the whole entire nation knows there is no get out of jail card, there is no loophole in the law that they can play, all of a sudden, the entire society becomes very, very sober. They very much become very awake in their dealings with each other, and they don't play games. You know, it's not like, oh, I can get away with this. Who's going to know about this? Or, I'll hire a good attorney and, I'll be able to get away with whatever crime I've committed. This kept Israel's society honest, filled with ethics, and full of integrity. You also find in Deuteronomy this idea that immorality, and this really is tied to morality more than any other concept. It's really morality and blood guilt. This idea that when we sin, that it causes the land itself to bear sin. So this particular verse, Deuteronomy 24:4, is talking about if a man and a woman divorce, they are welcome to divorce. What they cannot do is if the woman has remarried or if she slept with anyone else, he cannot take her back to be his wife once she has become someone else's wife or once she has no longer faithful to her husband. So this is what Yahovah commands. It says, her former husband, which has sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after that she is defiled. For that is an abomination for Yahovah. And you shall not cause the land to sin, which Yahovah your God gives you for an inheritance. So here we have this idea that when we sin, we actually cause the land to sin. The land bears our sins. You find this especially reiterated in Leviticus 18 in this idea of a land that is defiled. Now, Yahovah in this case is not only just talking to Israel, but he is reminding them of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Havites, the people that were in the land before Israel. And this is Yahovah's command to Israel. Defile not yourselves in any of these. Now, the preceding verses of this text had just outlined homosexuality, bestiality, relationships within a family that would qualify as incest. All of these specific sins, Yahweh commands Israel not to do. And he tells them that when they commit these sins, that the land becomes defiled. And this is what he says of the Canaanites. For in all these things, the nations that are defiled, which I cast out before you. And when the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it. And the land itself vomits out her inhabitants. So notice we have the idea of a land becoming defiled, of a land becoming full of sin, of a land bearing a people's iniquity, or bearing with a people's iniquity. And notice that it is diaspora that is the specific consequence of immorality. It says, you shall therefore keep my statutes and do them. You shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourns among you. Notice this, and this is a caveat. It doesn't matter whether this is an Israelite or a foreigner who lives in the land. Everyone that is on that soil is held accountable to the same code of morality. So this kind of puts a fork in the whole argument that that the law is just for the children of Israel. Rather, the law is universally for anyone who lives on Israel's soil. And so the stranger that sojourns among you, for all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were here before you, and the land is defiled. That the land spew you not out, also when you defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. For whosoever commit any of these abominations, even those souls that commit them, shall be cut off from among the people. Therefore you shall keep my ordinances, that you commit not any of these abominable customs which were committed before you, that you defile not yourselves therein. I am Yahweh your God. So notice this idea that Israel, God used Israel to spew out the Canaanites, the Hittites, all these nations before Israel. Why? Because they had committed abominations and they had defiled the land. The land was defiled. Now, I'm going to make a bold claim and state that this universally applies to every nation on earth. This applies to America. This applies to Canada. This applies to Europe. This applies to China, every single nation. If a people living on a land become filled with iniquity, especially immorality, well, when that nation's sins come to a full, Yahweh will spew those people out of their homeland. And you're already seeing some of this today in America. You see this massive wave of immigrant that are coming into the land. They are coming in at very, very unprecedented rates, and they are displacing the natives of the land. The stranger among you is becoming high above, and you are becoming very low. This is really the first of the final steps that a land has before the national judgment is fully effective. And then, of course, the next step would then be that the natives and the foreigners in the land make it so arduous and so difficult to live in one's homeland that you either naturally seek a self-inflicted diaspora, or rather there is such a wave of persecution and such a wave of death threats that you then are forced to flee from a homeland. And that's kind of the way that process works. So, does the land need rest from iniquity? Notice these previous verses have talked about the land bearing with or bearing Israel's iniquities. And we find in Leviticus, this is the testimony or the prophecy within a Leviticus. It says, "Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lies desolate, and you be in your enemy's land, even shall the land rest and enjoy her Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall rest, because it did not rest in your Sabbaths when you dwelled there in it." Now, there's also the concept of Israel giving the land rest through the release years and the jubilees. That's part of what you find is intended in this verse, but you find in other verses that it is actually Israel's sins that are intended as well. Jeremiah brings this out in Jeremiah 16:18. He says, "And I will recompense their iniquity and their sins double, because they have defiled my land and have filled my inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable things." So here you find this idea that the land itself becomes defiled, that the land itself bears Israel's sins. Ezekiel also brings this point out when God divorces Israel from his land. He says, "I will lay the land most desolate. The pomp of her strength shall cease. The mountains of Israel shall be desolate, and none shall pass through. Then they shall know that I am Yahweh when I have laid the land most desolate because of their abominations which they have committed." Now, notice that the land is healed by the same way. You heal the land, you heal the people. So you have 2 Chronicles 7:14. "If my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins." So you have several things that you are required to do. First of all, being called by Yahweh's name. That is the first step that you take. The second step, you humble yourselves and pray. Number 3, you seek Yahweh's face. Number 4, turn from your wicked ways. You actually have a requirement, something that you are required to do. You can't just give lip service. You can't just have a change of heart. That change of heart has to be followed with physical action. One of the differences in a Tanakh conversion, in the Hebrew concept of teshuvah, when you return to Yahweh, it is always heart and physical action. They're never separated from each other. The heart, the spirit, and the physical are really married. They go hand in hand. So when you have a change of heart, you show that by physically turning from your wicked ways. But Yahweh's promise is that he will hear from heaven and he will forgive their sins. But notice what he does when he forgives and he forgives the sins. What he does is he heals the land. By healing the land, it then in turn heals the people. So you find that these concepts really go hand in hand. Looks like, because I've lost my camera. But I just wanted to reiterate how the relationship between the land and Israel, they really go hand in hand, and not just for Israel, but really for any nation or group of people. So thank you for joining me. Let me go through and catch some of these comments real quick. And thank you for sticking with me, guys. I really appreciate that. What type is Israel administering? Let me go to that verse real quick. Let me look that up, Miriam, in Deuteronomy 19:12. So the type of penalty that Israel's would be administering in Deuteronomy 12, it would be the death penalty. Remember, especially where blood guilt is concerned, it's always eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. There was no other type of payment that could suffice. So anyways, thank you guys for sticking with me. And hopefully next week we'll have a much smoother transition. And next week we will get into the concept of national judgment. And the thing that we're also going to look at is America in particular, because we do actually have some definite things that we can look at, not just with ancient Israel, but America today. So thank you again, and Shabbat Shalom.